I forgot to mention that one can buy mugs down at the corner. It's called the Mo mug, and I think it has a very famous illustration on the front. I think there are 3 left. If you need some, you can order more. By the way. As the final event of today from the United Kingdom, we are happy to welcome Douglas Murray. In spite of his young age, Douglas has already made a name for himself as one of Britain's preeminent conservative authors, critics, and commentators. From 2007 until 2011, he was director of the Centre for Social Cohesion. They made a lot of good work and some noted publications on social issues in England or Britain. He is currently co-director, I think, of the think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. I should also mention that Douglas is one of the very few people alive who's been able to give that famous Islamic double talker, Tariq Ramadan, his comeuppance. Thank you for that. So without further ado, Douglas.
Thank you very much, Lars. It's a great pleasure to be back. I was just mentioning to somebody, actually, Doug Ramadan and I debated each other so often now that I never know which debate anyone's talking about when they mention our various encounters. But the last time we met in London, just a few months ago, for a debate on these matters, and I said at the opening, the chair said to me just before we went on, "Are you not worried, Douglas? You and Tariq have spent so much time together now, you might be in danger of becoming friends." No, not at all. But it's a great pleasure to be back in Denmark. It's a great pleasure to be back in Copenhagen and with the Free Press Society, who I follow closely from England. And I say it's a great pleasure to be with you. I should also open with an apology. I'm not a lawyer. And sometimes in London it feels like I'm the only person who isn't a lawyer. But the point is that having heard Anne's fantastic presentation earlier, I'm going to talk slightly away from some of the legal issues, but try to come around to, I think, making some similar points. And the first thing is to say that, of course, there couldn't be a better time to discuss these issues because but we collectively in Europe are in a mess at the moment on this issue. And I think it's a mess which matters, and the untangling of the mess matters, because it could still go any way. On the one hand, we've seen only in recent days the issue with the firebombing of Charlie Hebdo and the fallout from that. Once again, the now familiar routine. Even Time magazine, I think, just a couple of days ago, ran a piece basically saying why Charlie Hebdo deserved to be burnt down. And if anyone wants to take a crack at Time magazine now, they've made themselves open for it, because clearly if you disagree with something in a magazine, it's now simply expected as a matter of course that you don't write a letter to the editor as in the bad old days. You approach the office with a Molotov cocktail and have your say that way. And then on the other hand, of course, we also have and should consider the fact that there has been a very significant debate now, which has also arisen from the massacre in Norway carried out by Breivik. These twin things are worth mulling on, because I think somewhere between them we can find the way that these pieces will eventually arrange themselves. Because the mess that I referred to couldn't be worse in some ways. I mean, you heard already from Lars, you know the case of what Lars went through here, and cases like the case of Wilders And to my mind, and I hope to yours, if I'm not prejudging you, it doesn't matter whether people declared guilty or declared innocent. The fact that they're in a court at all is an outrage from the start. That is the problem. I have no interest in in non-guilty verdicts or guilty verdicts. It doesn't matter. The idea that people are in court for their opinions, and worst of all, in court for explaining truths, is a madness of our time. Now, I hope I don't sound too Anglo-Saxon if I just remind the current audience of what I would say are pretty English roots of the argument for freedom of expression, or at least the two best texts. The first being, of course, Milton's Areopagitica, the great defense of a free printing press in particular, which still bears rereading, I think certainly by our legislators. And the second text I'd cite as well is John Stuart Mill on liberty, written 2 centuries after Milton, but making many of the same arguments. And I would say that these arguments boil down to 2 things in particular. Mill cites 4 issues, but I'd hone them down to 2. That basically the importance of having as wide a remit as possible in free speech comes down to the fact that, firstly, you may need to hear opinions you do not want to hear, because you yourself may be in error. And if you're not entirely in error, you may at least be partly in error. And you may need to be put back on a good course, as it were. And you may not be able to get back on a good course unless you can hear speech which some people may wish to deprive you of. And secondly, the other defense being that even if the opinion is wrong, it can do you no harm to hear it, because in the hearing of it, you will know the arguments against your position, and in the process will be able to strengthen your own position. You will know better why you are right. You will know better why some things are true and some things are not. And you will be able to have a better armory to your own opinions. And I think this has to be borne in mind very carefully, because among other things at the moment, there are moves across Europe to criminalize speech and criminalize writing, which is often filled with error. Let me give you one quick example. The appalling Nazi apologist, so-called historian David Irving. Now, some people's responses is to him and to his faked scholarship is to criminalize him, to put him in prison, and so on. And I think that's exactly the wrong way to deal with him. The right way to deal with him is to debate him, is to have other scholars of equal or, more importantly, greater stature able to pick apart his lies. But if you don't do that, you can be absolutely certain that a few years down the line, you will have a generation of people who, when they are confronted by an Irving, who has spent many, many years in archives and knows his 1930s and 1940s handwritten German very, very well, you can be sure that there will be a time in the future, if you have simply criminalized that and locked people in prison, that you will have a generation who says the Holocaust happened, and of course it happened, and somebody else comes along and says no, it didn't, and the people saying it did are not prepared. It happened because we have laws to say it happened. It happened because we know it happened. But you haven't been able yourself to enforce that argument. You have not encouraged other people to enforce that argument. And so we become weaker as a society. We become less able to explain our own history. We become less able to explain our own truth. Now, there is a reason, I would say, that we are in a particular mess, and it's a reason which I think most of you will be aware of, which is that what is happening at the moment in Europe is not an arbitrary process. It is a particularly political process going in a particularly political direction. There is effectively a political, legal land grab. there are moves in only one particular direction. Let me give you an example of why I and many other people have come to that conclusion. If an imam in London says that, say, homosexuals are vermin and should be killed, very, very unlikely, in fact, we haven't had a case that that person would be tried, go to prison or so on. But if Lars Hedegaard or a similar figure were to say this imam says this, he will be investigated for Islamophobia, possible hate crime, and so on. That is simply the direction in which it goes. Let me give you one legal example alone from recent years. The case of Geert Wilders with fitna. Now, in the case against Wilders, as I say, innocent or guilty is not of any significance in these farcical proceedings. In the case of Wilders, the script of fitna was put in as evidence in his trial. The script, as you will know, almost entirely consists of the rantings and ravings of various extremist Islamist scholars, religious leaders. Among them, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Now, Geert Wilders can end up in court having to defend himself against charges of inciting violence by producing a film in which Qaradawi appears. But of Qaradawi himself, not a problem. Not only not a problem, but worse than that. When Yusuf al-Qaradawi came to London under the radical leftist mayor Ken Livingstone, he was literally received with a red carpet. Bowings and scrapings and your honor-ness, and everything laid on. Now, how can it be possible that Geert Wilders can end up in a courtroom for quoting Qaradawi, but Qaradawi is received on a red carpet for being Qaradawi? These two things are not surely possible. If Qaradawi calls everyone in this room apes and pigs, and Geert Wilders says that Qaradawi has called everyone in this room apes and pigs, it should be Mr. Qaradawi who is in trouble and not Geert Wilders. Yet the system in Europe has got this exactly the wrong way around. And I think we have to look at why that is, and it comes down to a moral motivation and a political misreading. And that is pretty much along the following lines. There is currently a consensus among the mainstream, as they like to call themselves, political parties, which in pretty much the parties that have governing control of most major European countries. There is a pretty much, or has been, an understanding that you really don't want to get into prosecuting imams for hate speech. You really don't want to get into that sort of thing because Islam and Muslims are a very vulnerable minority and are at risk of hate crime against them. Now, there are reasons you could go into for them to think that. There was in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, much less so now, I think negligibly. There has been racism in British society as in other societies. I think it's not a negligible problem, but it's nothing like a sort of tsunami of hatred and beating and killings and all that sort of thing. But to hear the political elites of Europe, you would think that is what it is. It's the same reason you have the almost nanosecond between any terrorist incident involving a Muslim and the immediate calls by politicians for there not to be a backlash. As if European publics are always having backlashes and forever burning down mosques and all that sort of thing. It's a complete misreading and a demonstration of mistrust and distrust of the populace. And I think this is worth considering. You see again, recently, after the Breivik atrocity, the same thing coming up. You see, a lot of people after that started pointing fingers. It happened, I know, here in Denmark, it happened in Britain, it happened around Europe and indeed in America. And it pretty much went around the following route, which was that if, say, you were Bruce Bauer and you'd highlighted terrible things that had happened in Norway, including honor killings and human rights abuses carried out by Muslims on Muslims, that basically you had laid the path for Breivik to do what he did. Now, first of all, I'd say that is an appalling libel on the people who that was claimed of. But secondly, it shows so clearly, as I say, the political motivation of people involving themselves in this. Because how can it be if an imam in Norway says kill people, he is not responsible? And even if somebody were killed, you go, oh, it's a misreading. You misheard. Yet if somebody who has not only never called for anyone to be killed, but has actively said quite the opposite, can themselves be blamed, as it were, for laying the groundwork? How can this be other than to attribute to this a deliberate political motive? If a non-Muslim explaining an Islamic human rights abuse is laying the groundwork for murder, but an Islamist himself calling for murder is not, something is wrong. Something is very, very badly wrong. And that is the situation we have ended up in. As Lionel Shriver, the novelist and fellow columnist of mine at a magazine in Britain called Standpoint, wrote after the Breivik thing, the interesting thing about, the thing that makes mass murderers different from everybody else is the fact that they mass murder. It isn't what they believe while they're mass murdering. Breivik could believe that he was following somebody I quoted earlier, John Stuart Mill. But I can assure you that John Stuart Mill was not responsible for Breivik. And it isn't just because he didn't have a machine gun. John Stuart Mill had no connection with that. And nor did other people who were slandered by association with it. But as I say, you learn a very great deal about your society when such obvious political motivation is at play. Now, I said earlier we were in a mess about this, and I'll cite two examples of the mess that Europe and indeed America, I think, are in on these matters. The first one, I'd say, would be the case of the Quran burning. It was mentioned earlier. The interesting thing about this, by the way, is it's almost impossible to do this from the British perspective, because the pastor in question was called Terry Jones, who was also one of the Monty Python team. And I found it very, very hard to take this story seriously from the outset, I have to say, because the idea that a member of Monty Python was at risk of burning a book somewhere in America, but in any case, this ludicrous, ridiculous fringe pastor, who I think his congregation consisted only of his immediate family, and they wanted to leave. This pastor managed to hold the world's press in the palm of his hand for weeks, and then you have major political figures making statements, secretaries of state. You have serious papers and broadcasters having, you open the paper in the morning, there'll be, the look at the weather forecast and also, significant possibility of a Quran being burned in America today. The likelihood has risen from possible to serious that this nut job's going to do this. And you see the complete confusion we're in. I think that burning any book is a bad sign and something I would instinctively distrust. But why does it become worse when it offends this particular group? I mean, and are you sure you want to set that precedent? Are you sure that? It's absurd. It is a definition of society ending up following things on Islamic terms rather than our own terms. There is, as I say, every reason to be very full of disgust for anyone who wants to burn any book. But, if a group of people who are great fans of F. Scott Fitzgerald come across a bloke somewhere who doesn't like The Great Gatsby and says that in a fortnight's time he might approach it with a box of matches, well, all the F. Scott Fitzgerald fan club have to do to prevent that atrocity happening is to say that they can't promise they won't be violent if it does. This is preposterous. And I say, if anyone doesn't realise the direction we'd be going in, with that. They're extremely foolish, but as I say, there's a reason for this, which is that there is a political drive behind this. Take another example. In recent years, hate speech laws in Europe have pretty much believed, as they have in Canada and other countries, have pretty much believed that, as I said before, the populace, we, the people, are terrible, terrible bigots who just can't wait to kill people and burn things and all that. And just can't be trusted. And in the end, it'd be best if we probably didn't vote, which is why they're getting as near as they can to that by having the European Parliament. But the thing behind this that's so interesting is that a political motivation there is that we must sort of, as it were, root out the last remaining remnants of certain hatreds. And let me give you an example. The Deputy Prime Minister in Britain, called Clegg, there's no reason you should have heard of him. I wish I had. This man, he gave a lecture to something a couple of years ago. I haven't been on the board of it. European Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and he gave a speech in which he bravely said that he was against anti-Semitism, and among other things, came out wholeheartedly to condemn Nazism. Wholeheartedly, no ifs, no buts. Against Nazism. And unfortunately, I had the first question. I said, it always seems to me that anti-Semitism, for instance, is much like charity. It should, and the fighting of anti-Semitism is much like charity. It should begin at home. So how come you've got a radical backbencher in your House of Lords, who actually at the time was one of the Foreign Affairs spokespeople for the Liberal Democrats, who's on record repeatedly saying all sorts of Islamist apologist stuff, all sorts of terrible things about Jews controlling the media? How come all that sort of thing? How come you ignore all that? But you're tilting at this completely fictitious wimble of sort of modern-day Nazism, as if the British people are about to, there's a significant risk that next week they're all going to put on swastikas and start jackboots and, march down. Well, if it actually is your problem, if you actually do want to root out racism, if you actually do want to root out anti-Semitism, start with the person sitting in your party. But of course, this is the problem. They are fighting last century's war 70 years too late, and expect to be congratulated for their political bravery in doing so. It's absolutely. Let me give you another example. John Galliano. Extraordinary case. So John Galliano, an obviously wrecked individual, a terrible alcoholic and drug addict and all that sort of thing. And one night in the gay district of Paris, he, out of his mind, starts saying disgusting things to a couple of strangers, which are anti-Semitic, which are horrible, all this sort of thing. You have all of these same worthies speaking up. I think we must condemn John Galliano. We must root out this sort of people. As if the biggest threat that we face in Europe from extremism is a drunk gay fashion designer in Paris. It's just not the case. But you can see how easy it is for it. It's so easy. It's so easy. And all of the worthies, all of the groups, all of the NGOs came out. I was at a dinner for an organisation in London that claimed to fight this sort of thing a few nights later, and somebody said, and we should also congratulate, who's that Hollywood actress who was in Star Wars? We've got to congratulate this guy for now coming out and refusing to wear any more of his dresses. And everyone applauded, as if this was an extraordinary stand against the major bigotry of our time. I think it's not as easy as that. It's really not as easy as that. And the fact that politicians and the sort of rights establishment think it is shows you so much about this. This is cowardice. This is terrible, terrible cowardice. They are believing that they are huge heroes and will pass laws until the last hour to make sure that no alcoholic designers in Paris can ever say that again, but they will ignore and refuse to prosecute somebody in Britain today, an imam who calls for Jews to be killed. Not as metaphor, not as metaphor, as fact, as request, as order. This is the most obvious demonstration of the decline of our political class. Now, let me give you one other quick example before I come to the upside. I learned some years ago you should never leave an audience in complete depression. Got to give them something to hope for. I did a panel for the legal project in America a couple of years ago, and there was a very, very nice girl who asked a question at the end, and she said, after hearing you, Mr. Murray, she said, you know, I used to believe in the possibility that the UN could do some good, but now I don't believe that. And I used to believe that maybe the EU had some good. I don't believe that now either. And I thought maybe the UN Human Rights Council, maybe they could do some good. Now I don't believe that. What is there that you can give me? And I said, you could try alcohol. But before that, let me just give you one other example of how complex this is and is going to be. There's a very troubling group in Britain called Al-Mujahirun. They're a very, very radical Islamist group. They're forever making extremist statements. In Britain, we showed that they're connected to more terrorism cases of prosecutions in the UK than Al-Qaeda have been. They're a very, very radical, very extreme, very dangerous group. We successfully petitioned my organisation to get them made illegal a little while ago, and it's perfectly clear they were breaking the law. And after a meeting where they reformed and assaulted a colleague of mine. Anyhow, this group, Al-Mujahirun, is a very good example of where our governments are getting it wrong, because Al-Mujahirun is going to, again, in a few days in Britain, use the 2-minute silence on the 11th of November, on the day of armistice, to shout and abuse the British Army and to burn poppies, which in Britain, as you may know, is a symbol of remembrance of our fallen from the 2 world wars. Now, they did this last year as well, and they've done it a number of times before. This, to me, would be a very pertinent thing to consider when considering where to draw the lines of so-called hate speech and such behaviour. Because Al-Mujahirun have so far been protected by police whilst they're doing this. Now, 2 years ago in a town north of England, there were returning troops coming back from Afghanistan, and this group, Al-Mujahirun, abused them in the street, held up placards calling them baby killers and so on. And again, they were protected by the police. Locals were very, very angry indeed, and the police made sure that Al-Mujahirun were able to keep going with their protests and so on. Now the reason I highlight this is for a very key reason, because the behavior of the police in protecting Al-Mujahirun and protecting their alleged right to abuse British soldiers and to abuse the memory of British soldiers led itself to a new problem, which was a group that formed in response called the English Defence League. This is a so-called grassroots movement, mainly working class British people, concerned about these issues. But they themselves have now caused a lot of problems. They go to have big demonstrations in areas often which are very Muslim, and there are often clashes. So-called anti-racism groups, which tend to be extremists themselves, extreme leftists, turn up, and there are pitched fights and battles, and all sorts of terrible things happen. I cite this for a reason. I don't have the answer to this, but I think it should be considered at least very seriously by the police, whether they aren't contributing themselves to the problem. Because I don't think that the EDL would exist if the police had not responded the way they did to Al-Mujahirun. The perception that they were not defending a legal right, but they were protecting people who were breaking laws, embedded itself, and now we have another problem on the back of that. So I cite that for that, just one reason. Finally, I just say this. The response that people tend to cite here is that we must have a political response and so on. But, and apologies to any politicians present, I don't think politicians can lead this, or will lead this. Politicians tend to be way behind any curve. Let me give you one quick example. Almost 3 decades ago, in the early 80s, a head teacher in a school in Bradford in England called Ray Hunniford said that it should be, he said in an article in a conservative magazine called the Salisbury Review, edited by Roger Scruton, said that he thought that his pupils ought to speak English. Now, for that, not only was Ray Hunniford's career destroyed, hounded out of his job, his career was over. Roger Scruton was also hounded out for being the editor of a magazine that would publish such an appalling thing. About 15 years after this, you couldn't find a politician who didn't agree with what Ray Hunniford said. And today, they all do. Nobody in Britain today will say that it is a good idea to encourage people not to speak English, any more than people here coming to Denmark to live and not learning to speak the language. But then, when it was first said, it was heretical, unbelievable. All the politicians condemned it. How appalling. Now it's common wisdom among them. And if you ever point this out to them, they always say, oh, well, it was the tone that he used. Whenever anyone says it's about tone, you know they've lost the argument on fact. But now everyone says this. 10 years ago, when Lars Hedegaard and I and others were saying all sorts of things about multiculturalism, all sorts of people would attack you. What? Oh, you're not attacking a policy. You're attacking you're obviously a racist. It must be a racist thing. But now, almost all of the argument has been taken up by Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, and David Cameron. Again, they will always say, it was the tone that was used in the argument before, and so on. But the fact is that it was people out of the mainstream who opened up the debate and made it possible for the politicians to walk into it. So this will not be solved by political leadership. It'll be solved by political following. And I would just cite one thing finally for some discussion, which is that the line I think is going to have to be defended and fought very hard in all of these discussions is the crucial divide between hatred of individuals and incitements to violence against individuals and criticisms of beliefs. And this is, particularly post the Breivik atrocity, a particularly fine line and a particularly important line to keep defending. Because as we have seen in recent days with the Charlie Hebdo apologists, as we have seen since the Danish cartoons, as we have seen now in a whole range of incidents, much of the political leadership in Europe and much of the judiciary does not understand this crucial difference. It does not understand that there is a crucial difference between an imam calling and ordering people to kill individuals, to hate individuals. A crucial difference between that and me saying, for instance, that I think Mohammed made the whole thing up. And that if I say the latter, I am not saying something equivalent to the former. And I'm not inciting any violence, I am stating a fact. And if our societies become incapable of noticing that difference, we're going down a very, very dangerous path. The most famous line, I think, in the freedom of speech discussion is always the quotation from Oliver Wendell Holmes on shouting fire in a crowded theatre and free speech stopping there. But of course, it's, as you all know, a misquotation. And that what Oliver Wendell Holmes said was that the free expression stopped where somebody knowingly and falsely shouted fire in a crowded theatre. But as I have said for many years, and Lars has heard me say many times before, if you are in a theatre and it is on fire, you will have to reserve the right to say so. So thank you very much.
so much. I, for one, am not depressed. But you are welcome to be depressed. If you have some pressing questions, speak up. Yes.
In 1987, we started the opposition against the Danish immigration policy. And we invited Ray Honeyford to speak to our meetings. And he was a very cultivated and a very bright and noble man. And I'm very curious, what was his fate when he went back? We talked with him about, in my opinion, the very great English politician Enoch Powell, who had the same fate as far as I know. He was in 1968 excommunicated from Edward Heath and his shadow government. And as far as I know, he was destroyed. I ask you, what was the fate afterwards of Ray Honeyford, and is the fate of Enoch Powell a sign that it is not possible to do what we have done in Denmark, to start an opposition against the immigration policy?
Thank you. Quickly, Ray Honeyford is currently, I think he has very developed Alzheimer's and has been very ill for some years, and I know his wife and says that this is largely been brought on by the horrible things he went through for years, and it was as I say, his career was over. It was an example of a full-scale hounding out and ending of someone's right to pursue their career, indeed, in his case. The case of Enoch Powell is a very interesting one. Does everyone here know or has heard of Enoch Powell? And I'm never quite sure how much it's travelled. I mean, most people remember Enoch Powell for the speech which ended his political career, certainly ended his political career in mainstream politics, which was the so-called Rivers of Blood speech. I mean, actually, in that case, I said earlier that the tone thing is but I would say, I think that it's been said in recent years that Enoch Powell made it impossible to talk about immigration in Britain for several more decades. I think that's a cop-out by the political class that claims that. But there were undoubtedly elements of what he said that were